pictures of Bill Weingart and others receiving him at the Hilton Hotel on Albert Street, and Minister Vezina joined me, and one or two others. But that was an indication of the tension, and that tension is picked up in Linda's book in spades of what the kind of tensions. And to this day, the Namibian new ambassadors, when they're appointed, and the same with the South Africans, it may have changed in the last few years, but as recently as 6 or 7 years ago, there was a long period before agreement was agreed to. Undue delays due to this continuing question of the ANC and SWAPO being terrorist organizations. The period then when I was Minister of Immigration, we were principally concerned with Central America, and I wasn't focused on that. When I left, I was invited then by Hugh Seagull, shortly after leaving the cabinet, to go to the United Nations and to be at the General Assembly. Stephen Lewis's, who'd been a long-time friend in any case from U of T days, to be a part of the Canadian delegation to the General Assemblies, which I did for 8 years, and worked with Stephen, who was extremely articulate. That provided for me a period of time, and I could spend the rest of the time on the opportunities there to follow up. And I had done some in opposition years around the UN on the mutual assured destruction of nuclear issues, so I understood the importance of being able to talk to ambassadors. Many parliamentarians and ministers came to the General Assembly. We could talk about Canada's commitment to them. And then I was assigned by Joe Clark to be his representative to SADC donors conventions, to the annual meeting of donors of the African Development Bank, the African Economic Commission, and to the other instruments across Africa, to say nothing of the chairmanship Joe had of the Commonwealth Foreign Ministers Committee, which I did some Sherpa work for, and attending the Commonwealth Heads of Government meetings, and witnessing those momentous between Mulrooney and Thatcher. To be in the room was an occasion. I mentioned that only that bearing the role, the Liberals following the next government appointed David Kilgore Minister without portfolio. I really had that function, working with the ambassadors and our high commissioners across Africa. And it was a tremendous 8 years through the period. Namibia, and let me say a word about Namibia. The President tells me the longest serving honorary consul for the government of Namibia, appointed without being asked in 1994, after I left Parliament, and I've seen their progress. They're a bit like, Namibia is a bit like Canada and the US. Same percentage of population, whiplashed by the events going on, and the currency, economics, and all of these things. When I was there last October, I was empathizing with them, and they with us in Canada over against the US. The Namibian experience, because of the nominal, and when I got to the UN, I worked with Ambassador Gambari of Nigeria, who chaired the Committee on Apartheid. And we brought parliamentary delegations every 2 weeks, 6 members of Parliament, down to talk, see the Third Committee, see what was going on with the Anti-Apartheid Committee and other UN operations. That provided us with beginning to get in the Conservative caucus, as well as others, some, and cross-party lines, some empathy in Parliament. That led to the subcommittee, which I chaired, on Canada and Southern Africa roots, which we tabled in 1992 on democracy, looking ahead post-apartheid, and so I was able to do that. So in conclusion, let me say that in Namibia, a final word, to this day, the Namibians continue to look to Canada. It flies under the radar. We had 1,000 Canadian troops as a part of UNTAG, 500 and 500. 50 RCMP police in the transition in 1989 in the return of the exiles. We had 50 led by Dick Hatfield, high-level election observers. We had an observer mission. As soon as it was over and we'd helped give birth, we left. And as my Namibian friends say, you know, in our tradition, once you give birth, we also nurture the child. We closed the mission, gave a small grant to Oxfam to continue under John Graham, their office, then withdrew from that. And because they fell, not the poorest, but in between, they were not eligible for the poorest of the poor or funding from Canada. And on my visit, I was there for 2 weeks in October. The same townships I went to before, during the struggle, before independence, are very little changed. The same in the townships for the colored or black community. And the struggle there, as in South Africa in my visits to the townships there, so little has changed that the question now, as President Gangop said to me, is with such a birth rate coming, the pressure for seeing nothing different, and with global communications now, what could be, that he's trying hard to restrain others, but needs, as they did in South Africa and all of the areas, the input of extractive industries and others, and therefore caught in this dilemma. And the real question for me, I've been attending a lot of lectures lately as a member of the board of the new Canada-Africa Chamber of Business, the whole role of China and the taking over of the infrastructure, because Namibia is not, like the port of Walvish Bay, is managed, put in by South Africa. The real question is, can the Namibian government really own it? In any event, the struggle continues. Let me to continue on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Walter. I'd like to now invite John to...
I'd like me over there. Yeah, if you want to. Well, I don't care. That's fine. It's just that I don't have a microphone. Oh, that's very clever.
Well, no, you have a most powerful microphone.
Not the first time that people wish I didn't have a microphone. Look, I'm not sure what quasi in front of government means. I presume I'm the quasi part, because we've heard about real government here from Keith and from Walter. I'm also not sure about coming to an event in the honor of Linda Freeman. I was out last night, my wife and I were out with our son Peter last night, and he was reminding us that he took one of her classes and telling us all sorts of wonderful things, beginning with the intimidating and moving on to the making better stuff of him. But my part of the story was that Linda and Jim McKinnon over here were the scourge of my life when we were in South Africa. In the years leading up to 1990, whenever I came back to Canada, I was asked to give some briefings to NGOs, and by golly, the two people you didn't want to have in the room were Linda and Jim McKinnon. And the worst one, I'm afraid, Jim, was Linda, because she took notes. She'd sit down at the edge of the table, and everything that I said I thought was perfectly anodyne, and she would begin writing, as we all wrote on pieces of foolscap in those days, and by the time I'd gone on for 4 seconds, her circles were getting bigger, and by the time I'd gone on for 20 minutes, she was taking up one piece of foolscap for each sweep of a pen. And I can see why, now that I've read Ambiguous Champion, I can see that that's what this was in preparation for. Now, I'm going to, most of the political part of things have already been spoken to. I'm going to talk on behalf of Carolyn and Ruth and Aubrey Morantz. What did it look like from inside the bureaucracy, but most particularly, what did it look like from inside the embassy? And when we were over there with the embassy, it was a tough time. People in embassies are supposed to behave in a certain way, and yet we were told that we were not to. We were to push the envelope. We were to do everything we could to be visible, to get the Canadian message across that we wanted change, and to support anti-apartheid groups, to support change. as vivaciously as we could. Now, why were we doing this? And why pick South Africa? And I came to wonder this same thing when we got later on to Zimbabwe, and we weren't given this sort of leeway to go out there and see if you could get kicked out. And that was literally what we were told, see if you can't be sent home. And we were told this by a thing that had been created in our department, the South Africa Task Force, whose whole job, under a guy then named John Scholler, was to think up with us in the embassy the things that we could do to make life miserable for the South African government, to put across the message that our government had and that Canadians had. And I think when we're thinking about solidarity here, we should ask, why would this happen in South Africa? Well, to my way of seeing it, to Elena's and my way of seeing it in South Africa, it was because Canadians like you people were driving it. Yes, Mulroney, yes, Clark, I have no doubt that their personal commitment to this was strong and deep, and without that leadership we couldn't have done it. But how did they get away with it? And this isn't likely to be the case again. I think this has only happened once since the Second World War, and that was in South Africa. Canadians wanted it to happen. Politicians led by Walter, people like that, standing up, agreeing with what the Prime Minister down inside wanted to do anyway, what Joe Clark wanted to do. Canadians in civil society were pushing it to do it. Academics were pushing Canada to do it. So knowing that, and this was by I'm talking now about 1988 to 1990, when de Klerk announced the unbannings and then Mandela came out. This was a job that Sweden took on, Australia took on, certainly the Brits did not. Whenever we went through London, I was told to go and see people in the Foreign Office, and they always tried to convince us that Buthelezi was the best answer, that we should just take it easy and calm down and negotiate. And I see my friend in South Africa, who doesn't know me at all, but Sir Robin Rennick has written a book putting Britain front and center in all of this. The Americans thought that they were doing it all. But when this was all over, the meeting that Keith Bezanson talked about with Mandela, but many other occasions, Mandela talking to him, Canadians were given a great deal of credibility. We had very high credibility, in fact, amongst those caught up in the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa. So here we were doing something not for the government. This wasn't something that just one party wanted to do in order to get elected next time. This was something Canadians in general wanted to happen. Now, of course, we did things. You've heard something from Walter about it. We did things with the United Nations. We had commitment to multilateral action through the Commonwealth. I've spoken about NGOs and civil society, the Canadian media, people who kept needling the government, pushing harder. They frankly didn't think, well, Linda's the best example of that. If you read Ambiguous Champion, we were ambiguous. We weren't doing enough, and we weren't doing it hard enough. We weren't doing what we actually said we were going to do. That was perhaps true, but what we were doing was what people there wanted us to do. Why was that? Because almost uniquely in my experience, Canadians were there. Guys like you were honestly there, and I'm not just saying this to make you feel good, I'm making us all feel good. We in our house every month, at least once a month, perhaps more often, got together all kinds of people who would never be able to talk to each other in any public place, who would never think of going to each other's houses for a conversation. And yet they could come to the Canadian Embassy because they trusted us. There weren't going to be security people, and these were people. Cyril Ramaphosa was a frequent guest. Helen Suzman was there, or Helen Joseph. People on both sides, the small group of white liberals who were working so hard at this against all odds, but also PAC, ANC, black leadership, coming there and spending the night drinking, I'm afraid, the taxpayers' booze until quite late in the evening, discussing. And did you think that all of that did some good? Well, yes, Judge Goldstone met his first ANC contact at one of these get-togethers at our place. Pierre Olivier, a guy who was in charge of trying to implement group rights, came to realize that group rights was just a fig leaf for more apartheid, and that this wasn't going to get the government anyplace. This was a National Party proposal that was going to carry them through the transition to democracy. They've written about this in books. This isn't just me saying so. In the department, we had all sorts of, the SATF. Is there anybody here who worked with the SAETF, the South African Education Trust Fund? Here on Nicholas Street in Ottawa. And anyway, my point being, we had all kinds of organizations, all kinds of things that we were doing. What were we doing in the embassy? Well, two things. My wife and I, but particularly my wife, was the administrator of a thing called the Dialogue Fund. What was so special about the Dialogue Fund? It came from Treasury Board. It did not come from CEDA. It came from Treasury Board, and therefore it skipped through all the accountability, which was a risk, of course, a risk that the government was willing to take and to stand up in Parliament and say that they were taking it. This was almost $2 million a year. Who had the checkbook? Well, first Lucy Edwards, and then when Lucy went home, Elena had the checkbook for this. Of course, she was a great deal more popular than I was when we went to functions, because this was a decision we could make right there in our embassy in Pretoria. No bureaucracy back in Canada, and this kind of support went, for instance, to sending a bunch of Stellenbosch students, certainly the first white students to go from South Africa to Lusaka to talk to the ANC. Paying for the Five Freedoms Forum to send a group of the first group of South African businessmen, businesswomen to Lusaka to talk to the ANC. We made a point of getting to know and trying to get people there to know each other, to recognize that there might be a way through negotiation later. And we have been told by even awful people like Pic Botha that this really did have an effect. So between us, between you people getting to know the leadership on the ground as well as ordinary South Africans in South Africa, and the embassy being told, I remember being sent off to Lusaka, going off to Lusaka to talk to Joe Slovo and Thabo and Becky late into the night, also over a lot of taxpayers' whiskey, I think, about giving up the armed struggle. And they explained to me why they weren't going to give up the armed struggle. In other words, we were getting feedback from them as to what Canada should be doing. So here was Elena's with her dialogue fund. 5 minutes? Oh, I can get done before that. My job, the part of it that I enjoyed the most, was what we called witnessing. And that was that it was our job to be out attending every single protest march, every single protest funeral, Uppington trials, Delmas trials, a lot of other trials, visiting people in prisons, getting ourselves into visibility so that people could see that Canada was supporting the anti-apartheid movement, and the other half was supporting a free press. Raya Wikblad, Anton Harbour in the Weekly Mail will tell you that without Canada's support they wouldn't have been able to keep going. So there are many more things that we did, but the basic point of my message is we were able to do it because Canadians wanted it to done in a way that probably won't repeat itself again. We were able to do it because the Prime Minister and the Minister were prepared to risk having the embassy closed, and indeed I was called in on a number of occasions and shown pictures of myself taken in secret, and they would say, look, there you're singing Nkosi Sikelele, there you're praying, there you're practically toying down the street. Diplomats can't do this, we'll throw you out. And our answer was, sure, fine, throw us out, but be aware that you'll be thrown out in Ottawa, and frankly, you need Ottawa, you need your embassies abroad more than we need to be here. There are lots of Canadians who'd like to see us close our embassy. We can do it. Were we wise to stay there? Well, I guess the next 2 days will show us. Were there lessons that could be used in Zimbabwe or some other place? I'll leave it to you to figure out. South Africa to me was a unique occasion, and to all of you, and it really does all of us, I'm sure, good to think that we're here talking about it today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. And that sort of rounds off our panel. We now have some time to be able to speak. Did you want to?